sculptor, painter, architect and poet. And yet he was an artist possessing unparalleled creative energy. Michelangelo came from the where his father, Ludovico, held a 6-month office as mayor, representing the city of Florence. One month later, the Buonarrotis returned to Florence, where, according to his biographer and contemporary, Giorgio Vasari, Michelangelo was handed over to a nurse at the family estate in Settignano, just outside the city. She also happened to be the wife and daughter of stonecutters. As Vasari tells us, Michelangelo would often joke about this, saying he drew his talent for sculpture from his wetness. The story, however, does focus attention on the lack of any direct influences upon his as an artist. At the age of 10, Vasari continues, Michelangelo went back to live in his father's house in Florence. His mother had died 4 years previously, and his father was recently remarried. By the age of 13, Michelangelo had overcome his father's hostility to him and was allowed to enter the studio of Domenico Ghirlandaio, who was decorating the apse of Santa Maria Novella. The main thing Michelangelo seems to have learnt from Ghirlandaio was the technique of fresco painting. From this period, we see some sketches he made from frescoes by Giotto and Masaccio, respectively, which certainly recaptured the plasticity and grandeur of the figures. A year later, Michelangelo left Ghirlandaio's studio to frequent the Medici Garden near St. Mark's. Lorenzo the Magnificent had turned his splendid residence into a cultural center for humanist Florence. In the garden, Lorenzo set up a school of art under the direction of Bertoldo di Giovanni, from whom Michelangelo appears to have learnt the art of sculpture. This was the period of his battle between the centaurs and lapiths, where instead of concentrating on the Greek myth itself, Michelangelo brought out his highly charged Platonic significance and expressed it in movement. Eliminating the background, the young artist transformed the hollowed surfaces of the relief into inert matter and raised surfaces into animated matter, where the stone was given form. It was also the period of the Madonna of the Staircase. In this work, we see how much the young Michelangelo was influenced by Donatello's treatment of relief, known as schiacciato. The image, Michelangelo said, is already alive in the stone block. All the artist needs to do is remove the material, hiding the image. At 19, Michelangelo moved to Bologna, where he was able to study the sculptures of Jacopo della Quercia in the door of the church of San Petronio. He noticed that much of the effect of Jacopo's power was obtained by slightly undulating the surface. Michelangelo adopted this method for the 3 statues he carved for the Arca of San Domenico in the same church. We see his candle holder in the form of an angel. Already this piece expresses the power and monumentality which Michelangelo was to make his own. The statue, in fact, is only about 20 inches high. In his work for this church, Michelangelo was already aiming at a synthesis between ancient classicism and Christianity. he returned to this very theme at the age of 23 in his world-famous Pietà in St. Peter's, Rome. The first of Michelangelo's 4 Pietas, this statue was carved from a single block of white Carrara marble. Here, the figures are conceived beyond their realistic forms. We can't help noticing how young the Virgin is compared to the Son. The ideal beauty of the two figures, and a certain disarticulation in the body of Christ. Finally, there's the lighting, which almost surrealistically brings out the smoothness of the form. In the Pietà, every effect is used to transcend the reality of such natural emotions as grief and despair. Ideal beauty and Christianity's dramatic simplicity are fused in one sublime experience. On the Sunday of Pentecost, 1972, looked at the hammer and mutilated the Virgin's face and left arm. Returned to its original state. At 26, Michelangelo was recalled to Florence to carve the Dead, which was to stand in front of the Palace of the Signoria. The statue we see today is only a copy. The original was moved to the Florence Academy in 1872. For his David, Michelangelo used a block of Carrara marble 14 feet long. 40 years previously, Agostino di Duccio had traced out a figure in the same block. It was so long and narrow, it might easily have presented limitations, but it offered the maximum energy in the figure. Michelangelo did not represent action. He expressed David's inner tension before the attack. Michelangelo had conceived the figure at the moment of deep reflection upon the action which was to follow. David gazes into the distance, as though he had the and belongs to the New Testament. Well, the big world. The link between the passive world and Michelangelo used to say, the closer painting comes to sculpture, the better it is. In 1504, Michelangelo found himself in the when in the with screen synthesis for the very first time. The lower arm form the base. Bottom, the symbol announce the coming of the Messiah. Down the center of the Genesis is the architecture. The first panel represents God, separating light from darkness. Then comes the creation of the sun and moon, with a majestic God issuing his commands. On the left, God heads into the infinite spaces to perform his next task, the separation of the waters and the dry land. The world is now ready to receive man. In the famous creation of Adam, Michelangelo conceived man as a heroic image of God. Man as the supreme synthesis of beauty. On the right, God shelters the image of Eve under his arm as he approaches Adam to transmit the touch of Then follows the creation of Eve, the titanic mother of humanity. The next panel shows original sin, or the fall of man. On the right, expulsion from the earthly paradise. Here begins the story of humanity. After the fall, man is now alone in his tremendous quest for redemption. The beauty of Eve before the fall seems to hold the ripeness and vigor of the earth. With the flood, Michelangelo exalts the heroic contrast between man left to his own devices and divine wrath, unleashing the mighty elements against him. Here, Michelangelo intends to show the futility of man's fight against destiny. It's been written that the arrogance of man before God is also a mark of his greatness. But his ultimate greatness must be repaid by ultimate despair. In this panel, the figures were almost entirely painted by Michelangelo's assistants. And also the figures in The Drunkenness of Noah. This final panel is linked to the sacrifice of Noah. With the prophets and sibyls, Michelangelo conveyed a urgent expression of his own tormented soul. prophet Jeremiah represents his personal meditation. We see the Delphic Sibyl, turning as though graced by sudden illumination. Or the prophet Jonah, who seems overwhelmed by some electrifying apparition. The master was forced to work on his back, with the paint dripping onto his face. There was no way he could check the effect of what he'd painted from a distance, because scaffolding blocked it from the floor 90 feet below. Among the gigantic figures we see the Inudi, the nude youths, symbols of the pagan classical world. The Inudi were Michelangelo's celebration of the physical beauty of the human body. Some critics see the Inudi as a splendid series of anatomical drawings. For others, they represent absolute beauty, which leads on to the concept of God. In the lunettes and spandrels, Michelangelo painted the forebears of Christ. In the pendentives, he put the heroes who saved Israel, like Judith, with the head of Holofernes. David, victoriously astride Goliath. Here the master isolated the group in a perfect pyramidal composition. The same occurs in the stupendous Crucifixion of Haman, or Triumph of Esther. All the power in the tortured body of Haman explodes in the desperate outthrust of his arms. Three centuries later, Goethe said, "A person who has never seen the Sistine Chapel could never form an idea of what man is capable of achieving." This documentary went into production while restoration of the Sistine Chapel frescoes was still in progress. These shots show us the lunette frescoes before cleaning. Here are the same frescoes after cleaning. The restoration has produced surprising results, the most striking of which is in the revelation of the colors. Bright colors and unsuspected contrasts in tone have appeared in the lunettes after the removal of centuries of candle smoke and grease. The colors have become brilliant, even in minimum illumination. It means the end of the legend of Michelangelo working almost in monochrome, when in fact he deliberately veiled his frescoes in shadow. The cleaning began in 1980 and will be completed in 1993. It's been called the restoration job of the century, proclaiming the glory of Michelangelo as a hitherto unknown master of art. Once the Sistine ceiling was finished, Michelangelo returned to the sculptures for the tomb of Julius II, which had originally brought him to Rome by a contract signed in 1506. The statues of the slaves in the Louvre Museum were intended for this tomb. The rebel slave writhing in his bonds in a frantic effort to free himself, and the dying slave who appears to have reached the threshold of liberation, the threshold of death. These statues were never to become part of Julius' grandiose monument, which we see in what are assumed to be Michelangelo's sketches for it. At the time, however, the Pope was very enthusiastic about the project. He sent Michelangelo to the marble quarries in the Apuan Alps near Carrara to select the blocks for the huge mausoleum he intended to raise in the center of St. Peter's. Michelangelo spent 8 months in these mountains, cutting blocks of the magnificent Carrara marble, which today is exported all over the world. When Michelangelo returned to Rome, however, he found that the Pope had changed his mind. He was now determined to concentrate all financial efforts on building the new Basilica of St. Peter's. As a result, Julius II's monument, replanned and postponed over and over again, took another 40 years to finish. By then it had been scaled down to a simple wall tomb in the Roman church of St. Peter in Chains. Symbols of triumph, slaves, captives, victories, were eliminated. Now Michelangelo introduced the statues of Rachel, symbolizing contemplative life, and Leah, active life. Rearing between them sits the great statue of Moses. The powerful forms of this figure recall the prophets in the Sistine Chapel. The Moses was the only statue among those conceived and carved for the first version of Julius' tomb, which was destined to remain in the completed work. Planned for a niche 12 feet high, the statue is a symbolic exaltation of the biblical patriarch, powerfully expressing his deep spiritual torment. The twist of the bust. One leg poised for action, the other tensely opposed to movement. The veins swollen with wrath, and the awesome glance, all clearly spring from Michelangelo's teeming inspiration. In 1520, we find Michelangelo in Florence, at work on the new sacristy, which was to house the tomb of Giuliano and Lorenzo de' Medici. As was the case with the tomb of Julius II, here too the unifying theme is death. Michelangelo conceived the chapel as an image of the universe. Below, Hades, kingdom of the dead. Midway, the terrestrial sphere. Up above, the celestial sphere in the dome. In this temple of eternal sleep, like recent arrivals from the living world, sit the figures of the princes. According to Vasari, Giuliano represents boldness and vigilance. For other commentators, he expresses the willful and violent character of the despot. It's more likely that the figure was intended to express action. Opposite sits Lorenzo, whom Vasari calls il pensieroso, the thinker. For other commentators, he represents the prince's meditation. On Giuliano's tomb recline the figures of day and night. On the other side of the sarcophagus, we see the statue of Day. Part of it is left in the rough, unfinished, as it's been called, to express the process of matter passing into form. The statue of Day has sometimes been considered a symbol of rebellion against slavery, but there are some who see in it the personification of wrath and contempt. The feeling expressed in dusk is calmer and less portentous. Beside it lies Dawn, the most sensual image Michelangelo ever conceived. In relation to Lorenzo, the two figures represent less explicit periods of the day, where action leaves space for reflection. The Medici Chapel could only present a vision of life in terms of grief and suffering.